Hi again, everybody. This is now lesson 2 of this series, and this one will talk about discipleship and baptism. This first part is just discipleship, the stuff in purple here. In our last lesson, I took you through essentially how to share the gospel. I talked about sharing your story could be a kind of a bridge to sharing the gospel, but the main point was how to share the gospel with others. And this is something that there's not a formula to do it, except for there are certain key components that we talked about to sharing the gospel faithfully. And here's the thing: Jesus calls us to share the gospel. It's on us to be faithful. It's not on us how someone else responds. In fact, a lot of times in the Bible, they responded pretty poorly. They didn't want to hear the gospel. You didn't fail if they respond that way. You may have succeeded very well if they respond that way. In fact, when I share the gospel, I look for one of three things that you see in the Bible. I look for people to receive Jesus and come to know him and become a convert of Christianity. Or I look for people to be heavily offended because they realize they are sinners and they can't do it on their own. They need a savior. Or I look for people who say, I got to really think about this. If I get one of those three responses, I think I did well. If I get a response like, oh, that's nice, somewhere there's something that didn't register. Okay, so lesson 1, we talked about sharing the gospel, though. And what do you do? I mean, the ultimate goal is that someone actually does receive the gospel. They receive the Lord and they want to start following him. So what do you do now? Well, that's where lesson 2 gets into how to disciple that person. Disciple means train them, means raise them up. In lesson 1, if you think about it this way, sharing the gospel and having someone come to Christ is like birthing a child. You have a brand new baby Christian. And lesson 2 is like raising that child up. That it takes a lot of time to raise them up. So the discipleship tends to take a lot longer for good reason. So we're going to get into discipleship general principles. In fact, the rest of our lessons are going to build off of how to disciple others. But these are general principles of discipleship. And we're going to talk about baptism in this lesson. So I want to show you something here first. In Matthew and Mark, the two first books of the New Testament, they talk about Jesus' life, and in the very end of both books, they have a lot of similarities. In the very last chapter of Matthew 28, it's talking about the resurrection. Mark 16, it's talking about the resurrection here. And then at the end of Matthew, it's talking about something called the Great Commission, and at the end of Mark 16, we have the Great Commission. All right. So we're dealing with essentially parallel information, all right, in Matthew and in Mark. But I want to show you something here. Mark 16, this is the last words of Jesus. Very important. These are the mission that he gives, the commissioning he gives to his disciples. What does he say to them? He says, go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to all of creation. That's his command. Go into all the world. Let's look at this here. Mark 16. Go all the world and proclaim the gospel. Makes sense. That's what we talked about in lesson 1. How to proclaim the gospel in all the world. Go. Now let's look at Matthew 28, where he says similar thing, but he adds something to it. It's fun to read the different gospels together because you see one thing in one gospel they emphasize and then another thing in another gospel, and it adds a little more color, a little more fullness to what actually happened. So in Matthew 28, it says something similar, but add something. So verse 18, Jesus came, and again, this is Jesus' last words, his last mission, his marching orders to the people who he's been ministering to. He's now resurrected. He's about to leave them and go to heaven. This is what I want you to do. Ready? Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. Okay? So I just want to highlight this part here. Go, make disciples of all nations. Let's look at that comparison. Matthew 28 says, go. It says all nations. So far, exactly parallel, right? You're going to all nations, but now it says make disciples, all right? This is the difference. Proclaiming the gospel, like I said, is trying to birth someone to become a Christian. So trying to birth someone, it's actually called the being born again. The new birth is what it's called in the Bible. There's a brand new life in Jesus that someone has. We'll get into this later, but God starts living in them. The Holy Spirit's in them and they change. That's the beginning. And how is that going to all begin? You have to share the gospel. You got to get up. You got to go. You do it to anyone, and you go and you share that gospel. But then someone believes, someone receives it. What do you do now? You just birth the baby. You can't just say, "See, I hope you make it on your own." They'll die. That's not the way God's designed the process. They will die. If my wife and I birthed the baby and we said, "Whew, we did all the work, good," and we leave the baby in the corner, that's abuse. That's going to kill the baby. So now we have a job. After we've birthed the baby, proclaim the gospel, now we have to raise up that baby. That's making disciples, making people who are following Jesus. Disciples just means someone who is following Jesus. So you say, I get that. Sounds great. Maybe a little scary. How do I do that? I'm so glad you asked, because Matthew 28 tells us the recipe. Jesus' recipe to make disciples. Go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then teaching them. Okay, before we get to the teaching, let's just look at this first part. Baptizing them. So, step one in making a disciple, I'll do it like this. Baptize them. That is the first thing they're called to do. And later in this video, we are going to look at what that means. So put a pin in that. We will get into the more detail with baptism, so I'm not leaving you high and dry. But I do want to jump into step two. Step two, after they are baptized, teaching them to observe all I have commanded you. Okay, so step two, you teach them to observe, or we can say obey. We're not just teaching them to just get a bunch of knowledge. We want them to actually obey Jesus. He has to become the Lord of their life, the boss, like we said in lesson 1. Teach them to obey. Okay, teach them to obey. And what do we teach them to obey? Teach them to observe or obey all I have commanded you. Teach them to obey Jesus' words. I mean, simple, not easy, but it's a simple concept, right? We teach them to obey Jesus' words. All right? So that gives us some clues here, and I'm going to make this even simpler. Step 2. All right? I'm going to give 3 words of what we need to do. We need to be a disciple, we need to obey. That's that word, observe. All right? So we have them obey. And what else? Well, I don't know how to say this any other way, but if we're obeying Jesus' words, one of his words is teach them. Teach them to obey Jesus' words. So Jesus, one of his words is this whole sentence. Teach. Starts with teach. So we need to obey what Jesus said, but we also need to teach to others what Jesus said. All right, so we're teaching that, we're showing them how to obey and teach. And then one thing that's kind of a given, you can't obey and teach what you don't know. Fair, right? So you need to know Jesus' words. Know Jesus' words, obey Jesus' words, and teach Jesus' words to others. All right, so this is, and I'll get rid of Mark 16 for now. We already covered lesson 1, how to share the gospel, but this now we are getting into how to make disciples of all nations. Excuse me. And this is the process. Again, simple, not saying it's easy, but simple. We start with baptizing them, and then we teach them what Jesus' words are. We have to ourselves know what Jesus' words are. We have to ourselves obey. We have to ourselves teach Jesus' words, and then we show them how to do that themselves. So we're not off the hook. If we're going to be a disciple of Jesus, we need to know Jesus' words. Hopefully these videos are helping. We need to obey Jesus' words. In these videos we talk about how to obey some things, and teach. In these videos we talk about how to teach some things. So you can kind of see why I'm crafting the videos the way I am. I'm kind of crafting them over the Great Commission that Jesus says in Matthew 28. Know, obey, and teach. All right? And so I need to do that myself as a disciple, but then I'm going to teach others how to know, obey, and teach. All right? And so how far does this process go? Well, let's go back to our note here. We looked at Matthew 28, and now we're going to look at 2 Timothy 2, verse 2. So let's go back to our little Bible gateway here, and this time we're going to 2 Timothy 2. I want to show you something that's, to me, a profound concept, and it really involves what we're talking about in discipleship. Paul is writing to Timothy, who is, Paul is one of the early church leaders, and Timothy is one of his maybe most well-known disciple. He's a big-time disciple of Paul. So let's look at 2 Timothy is the last letter Paul writes, and this is the last words he is sharing. So remember Matthew 28, the last words of Jesus. Go, make disciples, share the gospel first, of course, but then make disciples, raise them up. Now we're getting the last words of Paul. What does he say? Check this out. 2 Timothy 2, verse 2. What you have heard from me, Paul, in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Look at this process. I want us to go back to our document here. Now we're looking at 2 Timothy 2, verse 2. What does Paul say? He says, let's go back. What you have heard from me. So it started with Paul himself was the one who taught Timothy. So what you have heard from me, Paul. So it started with Paul. What you have heard from me, and the you in this whole letter is Timothy. Paul teaches to Timothy. Another arrow there. Oh, didn't work, but that's fine. Paul teaches to Timothy, what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses. I want you, Timothy, entrust this to faithful men. So Timothy is supposed to pass it on to some others, faithful men. And then trust it to faithful men who will, this is the faithful men, will be able to teach others also. So the faithful men will teach others. So do you see this succession here? So when we're talking about making disciples and we're baptizing them and we're teaching them how to know, obey, and teach others Jesus' words, now it shows us just how far reaching that should be. If I'm like a Paul, I'm teaching you, you're kind of like a Timothy, but then your job is to go and find people, faithful men, but you don't just teach them, you teach them how to teach others. Remember, obey and teach. You teach them how to teach others, and the process keeps going on and on and on. So these are 4 generations here, from Paul passing on to Timothy, passing on to faithful men, passing on to others. This is what we're looking for when we're talking about discipleship. I don't want it to just stop with you or stop with the people you're discipling. I want it to be passed on. This is a relay race that started with Jesus, passing the torch on and on and on. And I don't want to be the one that the torch stops with. It's like, or someone mentioned it, like it's kind of like a candle. You know, you light a candle and it passes on, passes on, passes it on. I want to light someone else's candle before my candle goes up and I die, and I don't want the witness of Christ to die in me. I want to pass it on to someone else who can pass it on to others. I don't want you to be the one that stops with. I don't want the people you're discipling to be the one. I want everyone to hit this charge to pass it on, pass it on, pass it on, pass it on, until we light up this whole world with the beauty and the blessing of Jesus. All right. So that kind of sums up this discipleship portion. But I want to end with this question. Are you willing to know, obey, and teach God? Are you willing to do that with God's help? Are you willing to do that? All right. And when I'm talking about that, I'm not talking about at the level maybe that I'm doing it. I mean, I've been a believer for more than 17 years, and I was even before that, I was raised in a church and got a lot of knowledge that way. So you might not be knowing. I mean, you probably at some level you're learning from me in this video. I'm not expecting you to be able to say everything I'm saying. Go pass this video to someone else if you want to exactly replicate what I'm saying. What instead I'm wanting you to do is know Jesus wherever you're at. Learn more about Jesus and His Word. Obey Jesus wherever you're at. It might be very simple steps of obedience. It might be just sharing the gospel with one person, and you've never done that before. I don't know. But do where you're ever at. Maybe it's just sharing your story. I don't know. Know, obey, and I want you to teach others. And again, I'm not expecting, you might not be able to hit every point I'm hitting here. I don't care. You know what? Honestly, in this lesson, if you taught Matthew 28:18 through 20 and 2 Timothy 2:2, I'll highlight these there. That's great. Open the Bible, read those with the person you're talking to, and say, I want to read this together, and then just pray about it and say, God, how can we do this? That's all you need to do. You don't need to have any fancy teaching thing. I'm kind of helping you here with this little document, Matthew 28:18 through 20. I'm trying to kind of synthesize it and show it here. Hopefully that helps. I'm trying to help you here with this document. You know, it's essentially the same thing I've just mentioned here. And so you can just walk through word by word here. Whatever helps you. You can even show the video with them. I don't know what will work for you, but I want you to think in what capacity you can do these things. Are you willing? And that's the question I want you to ask. Seriously ask right now. Are you willing to do these with God's help? If the answer is yes, I'm willing, then awesome. Come back for the next video. We're going to talk about lesson 2B. We're going to talk about baptism and how to, remember step 1 was baptize, how to do that. What does that look like? We're going to talk about that. If you're honest, and I would really respect this, if you say, you know, I'm not willing to teach others. Now that's different. You might say I'm not good enough to teach. I don't have confidence. Okay, that's one thing, and that's what I'm saying. Just teach what you know. But if you're saying I know something, I just don't want to teach others. I don't want to share what I know. Kind of want to hold it in. That's a problem. Or if you say I know things, I know I need to obey this. I don't want to. I'm done. I don't want to. Or you say, I don't even want to know more because I'm just scared what I might find out about God and have to obey. It's honest. Wherever if you have to say no to any of those things that you don't want to know, obey, and teach God, I'm going to say, repeat lesson 1, look over it again, what the gospel is, and I want you to consider refraining, stopping at this point from further discipleship meetings. That is, from me teaching more and you teaching others more, unless and until you are willing to know, obey, and teach Jesus with God's help. You can look that up on your own. James 1:22 just says, don't just be a hearer of the word, be a doer, or you're deceiving yourself. And so I can respect if you're saying, I'm not there, I'm not ready. Go through it, pray about it. I'll pray with you, but I don't think you should be moving on to lesson 2B. It'll be here when you're ready. We'll be here. We're ready. But until you can say a confident, yeah, I'm willing. I might not be that good. I might not do it very well, but I'm willing to do what I can. Once you're at that point, then come on back here and we will do lesson 2B, baptism, next.